This week is a big turning point for us. We're leaving behind some other conceptions of culture and society that we've talked about already. And this week and next week, we're talking about what's generally called Durkheimian approaches. For those of you who haven't taken a sociology class before, this of course refers to Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist of the late 19th, early 20th century. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll say more about that in a minute. A couple things. Here's the quick outline for this week's lecture. We've got, I want to do kind of a quick recap. Where are we coming from? Situate us for what we're about to hear in this lecture. Then we're going to talk about a number of concepts from Émile Durkheim. These concepts include the words solidarity, collective representation, collective conscience, rich and rituals. There's some other more minor concepts, but those are four that certainly stick out and that you should make sure to get into your mind. And then we'll close the lecture with some comments. I'll have some brief comments on this idea of liminality. I especially focus on that because that comes up in the reading for this week. Now, I consider these 2 weeks some of the most enjoyable thinking about culture. I've been studying Durkheim now for 7 or 8 years. I'm still trying to figure out all the depths of the concepts that he's given us, and I consider his to be one of the maybe most important as well as almost intuitively interesting ways of thinking about culture. I hope you find that the case too, and that next week we'll continue on with some more of his thoughts. Before I go any farther though, let me say a few things about the midterm. We are quickly coming up to the midterm. It will be next Friday, so not the Friday of this week, but the Friday after that. Note that that's a little different than our normal schedule. Usually things are due on a Thursday night. I wanted, though, to give you guys as much time as possible to study because, and you've no doubt noticed this already, we actually have content in next week's class and the midterm. Because of that, the midterm will have, as I mentioned in the midterm review memo, we'll have a number of questions about these 2 weeks. And I've also gone ahead and said that the actual main essay question on the midterm, half of it is really about the content of these 2 weeks. So I didn't want to just do these 2 weeks, plop a midterm, and have you think that everything's up for grabs. Now, everything will be potentially covered in that midterm, but I wanted to focus you, I wanted to direct you and say, look, because we're packing a lot in, I'll go ahead and tell you right out of the gate that you're going to have to understand these 2 weeks pretty well to do very well on that midterm short essay. Please take a look at that midterm review sheet. Everything's on the table. Lectures, discussion posts, wrap-up notes, emails I sent you, the blog, everything we've covered in the course will be on the midterm, but you should know what we've covered in discussions and quizzes and lectures. Those are the main things, the main points. So if you've been doing well on all of those things, you're going to do great on the midterm because the midterm is kind of bringing all those different competencies together. If you've been struggling on some of those things, then pay attention to the areas where you've struggled on. Please send me questions. Email me questions. Worst comes to worst, call me if you can't get a hold of me. But please kind of keep me in the loop as you guys are stumbling through or wanting to make, that was not an earthquake, by the way. If you're wanting to make sure that you're going to do well in this midterm. I think that's it off the top of my head, except to say that we'll have the midterm, we'll have spring break, and then the second part of our course will kind of go into a number of different ways, which I hope are as equally as exciting. But as we finish these 2 weeks, by the time that also is not an aftershock, sorry about that. By the time we finish these 2 weeks, you will really have had a good grounding in how sociologists think about culture and society. And what's most important is that you see that these are traditions that you can come back to and tap into for fruitful ways of thinking about culture and society. And if you think you have a career in this, and I think some of you might, to really kind of further our knowledge and our understanding of the social world. So let me say a few things about where we've been coming from. So, we've looked at culture and the relationship between culture and society in a number of ways. For example, in the values tradition coming out of Max Weber, we looked at this kind of interesting, curious concept of values that we hear about all the time, and then we kind of tested it and said how sociologists thought about values, how has that not worked, and then what are ways that it might have worked. But we've seen that that values concept is somewhat of a package concept, this sense of kind of these internal normative orientations or normative directions and individuals that may or may not be shared in societies and may or may not distinguish the actions of individuals. So it was this kind of highly technical, isolated concept. We've looked at a Marxist approach which saw kind of culture as something that spun out of what it considered the real material conditions of life. And so in a classic Marxist sense, culture was kind of secondhand, kind of off to the side, and in maybe some of the most astute versions of Marxist analysis saw culture as ideological in its effect in terms of explaining or covering over the reality of society, explaining the economy and society in a particular way that doesn't actually help us to see through to the true workings at the base of society. And then we read a number of kind of spin-offs of that Marxist approach, particularly from Gramsci and Adorno and Horkheimer, where they put aside some of the core Marxist claims that culture is secondary or epiphenomenal, which means driven by the base. They kind of put that aside and wanted to see a more dynamic relationship between the two and to see how cultural stuff produced in a mass society by the culture industry could almost in a more crass way legitimate particular concentrations of power and particular messages that they thought in their critical spirit were anti-human. And then finally we kind of had a look at cultural stuff, that production of culture approach, where we talked about art worlds and we talked about institutional organizational conditions to producing mass cultural stuff. We were looking at culture as more of an object. Well, this week takes us in a new direction. And for Durkheim, the core concern, as I see it from Durkheim, is that his core concern throughout a really productive 40-year career is the concept of moral order. All right, this lecture is going to be rather concept heavy, so make sure you pay attention to these as they come out. So in comparison to these past approaches, Durkheim was not just interested about values, individual values that may or may not be planted in us. He was not looking at culture as this external ideological force that tried to justify injustice or tried to kind of plant messages into our head. And he also wasn't looking at just cultural materials independent from other aspects of society. Instead, he kind of wraps all this together. And Durkheim, of course, maybe the most society-focused of all the sociologists, sees society as this really incredible whole that is both kind of strong and fragile at the same time, both mundane and wonderful at the same time. So Durkheim actually brings together a number of elements in how he thinks about society. What he's most core interested in, and this comes to this notion of moral order, is he wants to know, how does society stay together? Now, we could turn on the nightly news and we could read about culture wars between the presidential candidates, and we could read about violent war conflicts and civil war in Syria. And so we can see all sorts of evidence of fractures in society or how sometimes societies pull apart. But Durkheim kind of causes us to ask a strange question, which is, well, how is it that society is held together in the first place? Or in the case of the United States, how is it that here we are over 250 years later, the founding of this particular society, this particular nation state, and how is it that we're still hanging together? And in Durkheim, you'll see that the content of culture, so the cultural stuff, maybe symbols or objects, the creation of cultural stuff, and the implications of how that cultural stuff comes to be are all wrapped together in one rather seamless cultural process. We'll try and take it apart a little bit into its pieces in the rest of this lecture, but for him it's all wrapped together. And he in some ways approaches culture almost in a way that we critiqued at the beginning of the course, in terms of that he wants to see culture is the seamless whole that is part and partial society. He's not a Marxist in wanting to break these things out. He's not a Weberian in wanting to see them in us individually, but his object really is society, as this thing that is natural to us because we live in it and it always seems to have existed. How else would we be here? But he wants to actually pick it apart and say, hey, this is something pretty special, this thing we call society. So how did it come to be and how does it sustain? And he had a useful term for us to think about the glue of society, which he called solidarity. So to Durkheim, his core question was how society can be held together. And he's particularly interested in this question because of what he saw going around him in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, which is modernity, the explosion of modernity, economically in terms of capitalism, politically in terms of democracy, philosophically in terms of individualism. And he was kind of preoccupied, well, can things hang together now in the modern world like they did in an earlier era? We could say a lot more about that, but for him the core question was about solidarity. So in other words, what was the glue, what was the connections between you and me so that the first reality of the world in his eyes is society? Not, as a lot of us have grown up, the first reality being individuals who then choose to be a part of society. No. For Durkheim, the first question was always, and the first kind of defining principle of life was this solidarity, this connection of the social world between us, between past generations and us, between us and future generations, and how this was accomplished, how it was created. He had a kind of a couple of puzzles that I'll throw out there that he looked at. He wanted, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but he wanted to see how the very nature of how we think about the world is not something that we've just come up with as individuals, and not something, according to Plato and according to Immanuel Kant, that's just floating out there and are kind of these universal principles that have existed throughout time. But he wanted to see how our experience of the world, yours and mine, is fundamentally due to the social group that we're a part of. And this is related to this, he wants to see how is it that we keep doing this cooperation thing? How is it that solidarity keeps happening? And he wanted to push back against what we would call philosophical liberalism, people like Locke and Hobbes, who see individuals first and think to themselves, oh, individuals must have decided to get together. He wanted to push back against that and say, no, that's too individualistic. And he also wanted to push back against psychologists or people like Adam Smith, who would see kind of who on the other side saw individuals choosing kind of contractually or consciously to be a part of a social group. No, Durkheim names this level of society, says it's not a force created by something bigger that spits it out, and it's not a force created by something smaller, i.e. individuals, that comes and puts it together, but he wants to see it as its own thing. And so culture, in a Durkheimian sense, is very interesting because it wraps up all parts of things that often you and I don't talk about. So let me pause, I'll come right back, and we'll dive much more into Durkheim and those concepts.